March is Women's History Month, and this is day 29 of talking about strong women, women you need to know. Let's talk about Florencebascom. Born in Massachusetts, July 14th, 1868, she was the youngest of 5 children. Her father was a philosophy professor, and her mother was an advocate for women's rights. They both encouraged her in different ways, and both became very important to her later in life. Her father would suffer bouts of mental issues, it was said, and one of the things that he did to help with that was take excursions, and he would take the children with him. And it was during those times that he taught his children to look at nature differently, look at the landscape differently, and that had a very big effect on young Miss Bascom later in her life. Once they got to Wisconsin, they had moved to Wisconsin from Massachusetts, and her dad was now the president of Wisconsin University. About a year after getting there, the university that had not accepted women as students was now accepting women's students. Well, young Miss Florence was very smart. She had graduated with high honors at the age of 16. Once completing that education, she decided she wanted to go to college, and since the university where her dad was president was now accepting women, she decided to go. By 1882, she had received the first of 2 bachelors, the first in arts in 1882, and then she received a Bachelor of Science in 1884. But that wasn't enough for young Miss Florence. She wanted to learn more. She wanted to pursue the field of science that she had learned to love as a child on her excursions with her dad. So she went back to school and got her master's in geology in 1887, making her the first woman in the US to do so. That still wasn't enough for her, so she decided she wanted to get her PhD and chose Johns Hopkins University. That didn't go over well with the president of Johns Hopkins University. He did not believe in co-ed education. She was not going to give up, though, and persisted, and he finally relented, and she was admitted to Johns Hopkins to get her PhD, making her the first woman to do so at that university. They didn't make it easy on her, though, and apparently it was custom, if there were co-ed classes, for women to be put in the corner and put behind a screen. And that's what happened to Miss Florence. She had to sit behind the screen in the corner so as not to distract the male students, because we're responsible for their behavior even in school. Because boys, I said that out loud, didn't I? Anyway, she continued her studies and received her PhD in 1893, making her the first female to do so at Johns Hopkins University, and making her the second in the U.S. to get a PhD, the second female to get a PhD in geology. The president at least wrote her a letter afterwards and said, "You have won your honors without any favoritism, just as all other candidates among us have won their diplomas by talent, practice, and exertion." So he at least gave her that. She went on to teach at Ohio State for 2 years, where she was an instructor and an associate professor, but then went on to, I may be getting this wrong, Bryn Mawr College, which was all female, in 1895, and immediately established the geological department at that university, and it quickly became one of the best in the U.S. She knew there was more to teaching. She knew she still had to do, or more to geology than teaching. She knew she still had to get onto the field, and she had already, in 1894, had become the second woman elected to the Geological Society of America, and then in 1896, she became the first woman to work for the US Geological Survey. The work that she did there was during the summers when school was out. She went out and did her field work, mapping, surveying, testing, things like that, just, she said, as a regular fellow would. And then once school started, she came back to school, and that's where she completed all of her research, the writings, the papers that she needed to do, and testing on the samples and stuff like that. By 1899, she was teaching petrography, which was her particular field that she loved. In 1906, she was a full professor By 1924, she had become a counselor with the Geological Society of America, and by 1930, she became another first, the first female ever to hold a position, and she was appointed the position, or elected the position, of Vice President of the Geological Society of America, the first female to hold such a position. It is said that her graduate program was one of the hardest and most rigorous there was. She was very hard on her students, and of course, which were female, and they knew she was hard on them, but they understood that she had paved the way for all of those who came after her because she was a first, and they appreciated her work. And she had some very famous people come out of her classes. There were paleontologists, crystallographers, glacier geomorphologists, petroleum geologists, and much, much more. And many of her students were written up in the journals and publications in that field, just as she had been. So they appreciated her, the hard time that she gave them. She taught more women than anybody else in that field, it is said. She was a mentor, instructor, professor, author, publishing over 40 papers in her field. She taught at 4 colleges during her time. She inspired women in the field as none other had done before. It's also an interesting story that while she was at Bryn Mawr, she felt that on their excursions that they had to take, some would last 2 or 3 hours, that the girls should get credit for phys ed as well. But there was some argument with the men who were on the school board and the ones in charge that their short skirts that were required for the athletic classes, the phys ed classes, would be distracting. So maybe that they could like find a happy medium and wear their walking skirts instead on their excursions. And anyway, she won. The girls got the credit for their phys ed. She worked at Bryn Mawr for 33 years, retiring finally in 1928, but continued with the US Geological Society until 1936. The inspiration she had from her dad on their excursions inspired her, and the work in the women's movement that her mother had done also inspired her, both in different ways. One in a field that just wasn't done with women, and one in a way that taught her to stand up for herself and other women that would come after her. She passed on June 18th, 1945, at the age of 82. So today, on day 29, we celebrate this pioneer in her field of geology who was inspired and went on to inspire others. So Miss Florencebascom, we salute you.